Good evening. My name is Barbara Kuster. I'm the director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture right here at the University of Montana. I have the great pleasure of introducing our very, very special speaker this evening, who's appearing as part of the wonderful President's Lecture Series. Special thanks goes to President Royce Engstrom for his support of this annual series. Mark Stevens received a BA from Princeton in 1973 and then did graduate work in history at King's College, Cambridge. He decided he was more writer than historian and left with an MA in 1975. Mr. Stevens worked briefly for The Economist in London, then for Newsweek in New York. He became Newsweek's art critic in 1977, where he continued for about 10 years, and then became the New Republic's art critic and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair well into the 1990s. In '96, he became the art critic for New York Magazine. He left New York Magazine in 2007 to concentrate on writing books and plays. He's also written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, and many art magazines, as well as catalog essays and monographs, including the catalog for Sense and Sensation, Laurie Fendrick Paintings and Drawings, 1990 to 2010, the wonderful exhibition currently on view in the Paxson Gallery at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. That, of course, is in the Performing Arts Radio Television Center. We are thrilled Mr. Stevens is here during our presentation of this artist, and hope you all come visit, as he will be discussing Laurie a bit tonight. Mr. Stevens' novel Summer in the City was written in 1985, and his highly, highly acclaimed biography, De Kooning, An American Master, which he wrote with Anna Lynn Swan, was published by Knopf in 2005. It won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the 2005 Los Angeles Times Book Award for Biography, and the Ambassador Award for the English-Speaking Union. It was also named one of the 10 best books of 2005 by the New York Times. It's an incredible read, and I'd like to just share a moment of it with you now before he comes on, if I may. Every immigrant is broken, sometimes beautifully. De Kooning remained a man forever in between, suffused with private longings, regret, loneliness, and melancholy. Holding on to paradox was, among other things, a way to let nothing go. Was he American or European? Cruel or kind? Spontaneous or calculated? An admirer of high or low culture? Devoted to the past or the present? A radical or a conservative? A hater or lover of women? A man of the city or the country? Whatever was said of de Kooning, the opposite also seemed no less true. I hope that intrigues you to go and buy this wonderful book, which will be available this evening after the presentation. And Mr. Stevens is currently working on the biography of the British figurative painter Francis Bacon. He has several surprising connections to our great state. It is extremely interesting to note that Mr. Stevens' ancestor, Isaac Stevens, who surveyed Montana and our region in the 1850s, was a West Pointer and the first governor of the Washington Territory, which then included Montana. In fact, Stevensville, Montana, is named after this ancestor. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Isaac Stevens returned to fight for the North. He was a brigadier general who was killed at the Battle of Chantilly in 1862, where he took a bullet through the temple during a thunderstorm carrying the flag. And when he mentioned all this to me, he said, "You couldn't make this up." His grandfather was Secretary of the Army during the McCarthy era and loved Montana. So he bought a ranch near Two Dot in 1945, which Mr. Stevens still visits about 3 times a year. He's written for the Yellowstone Art Museum in Billings about Montana and art, and has several close friends who are Montana artists. He hopes to write more about Montana generally in the future, and we thoroughly look forward to that happening, hopefully very soon and very often. Please give a warm Montana and UM welcome to Mr. Mark Stevens.
Thank you, Barbara, for your very kind words, undeserved, and for your fine presentation, may I say, of the Laurie Fendrick exhibit, which I hope everyone here will visit. And thank you, President Engstrom and Professor Drake, for inviting me here to Missoula and the University of Montana. And thank you, Tom McElwain, and your ancestor, Lucille Spear, I believe it is, who initially established this lecture series and set up terms that would allow someone like me to be brought here, a very offbeat sort of New York character in many ways, and not, I'm sure, the usual sort of person who gives this lecture. I'm always at home here, even though I live in New York, and you've made me feel warmly welcome. My friends in New York, however, remain rather mystified by my relationship to this state, often saying to me, in effect, Montana must be your refuge from the city and the modern world, an escape from claustrophobic streets, the hustle and bustle, and yes, from celebrity culture too. I always tell them, are you kidding? Not at all. The two places, despite obvious differences, have this in common. Each is an intense environment, rich in character and characters. No palm trees. As for providing a refuge from celebrity culture, well, come on. Montana is no innocent ingenue. Though Montanans are pretty good at seeing through flim-flam and fakery, I've discovered. During my life, I've learned as much about celebrity culture here as I have in New York. Whenever I hear that phrase, the last best place, I reach into my pocket because I know it's about to be picked. But much more about Montana and celebrity later. The title of this talk, The Endless 15 Minutes, Fame, Celebrity, and Art Today, comes from a piece I wrote some years back called The Endless 15 Minutes, and it derives from Andy Warhol's quip, in the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes, an observation now more than 40 years old. Warhol's aphorism has lasted because it wittily captures fame's evolution into what we call celebrity. Fame, it was once thought, was a consequence of rare achievement. It was timeless, lasting, made of marble. Celebrity, by contrast, is fast food fame, throwaway fame, fame stripped from accomplishment, fame inflated until it has lost all intrinsic value. Not marble, wrapping paper. Among the serious-minded, the cheaper manifestations of celebrity are today regarded with a kind of bored horror. I sometimes find myself in this group, as I'm sure many of you do. I don't recognize, indeed I've never heard of, and I don't want to hear of, many of the people I see on magazine covers in the drugstore. I can't believe that a gassy orange windbag like Donald Trump, or a silly sock puppet like Lindsay Lohan, commands so much attention. Sometimes 15 minutes is too long. I love the playful qualities of the internet, but the celebrity parade really profoundly bores me, wearies me, always changing, always the same. Warhol's 15 minutes has itself become a cliche, often repeated, and actually becoming rather old. I want out, but out is, I think, an indulgence, dull in its own way. Celebrity culture is too important and enduring a part of our culture now to be cast off with easy condescension. Its superficiality runs deep, to the heart, or at least near to the heart of what we've become as a society. It infiltrates, it's an addiction and an implication. I wouldn't be surprised if a future historian refers to our period as the age of Warhol, or if when most of the famous figures from our time are forgotten, Warhol is remembered. I'm going to briefly outline what I consider the psychic sources and something of the history and character of celebrity culture, but my main concern tonight is actually not mainly academic. I want to think about this subject as a writer or an artist might, one who willy-nilly must respond to his or her own time, whatever that time might be, and develop a living perspective on celebrity culture. How do we come to terms with this phenomenon? What do we do about it? How are we to think about it? De Kooning used to like to say, when he looked at the ocean, I reflect on the reflections. We can do something similar with the reflections emanating from celebrity culture. It's really part of confronting one's own time, developing one's own sensibility, and living what used to be called an examined life. Celebrity culture is not easily dismissed because it depends upon three human traits that in all likelihood are hardwired into us: the love of gossip, the love of spectacle, and the love of status. Gossip typically seems trivial to us, passing, often wrong, and sometimes cruel. However, that doesn't mean gossip is insignificant. It is less the mercurial content of gossip that matters than the act of gossiping itself. Trivial talk has great social utility. It creates connections among people, establishes groupings, defines social boundaries, and controls behavior. Gossip can fashion an enemy to despise and a friend to despise that enemy with. It helps manage love and sex. It provides a place for confession and criticism. Gossip helps communities live and breathe, as I'm sure you in Montana know, socially on a day-to-day basis. We do not like, none of us likes, to regard ourselves as gossips, but we protest too much. Do you think Socrates, dining with Plato after a day's discussion, continued to talk about philosophy? I doubt it. More likely, the conversation was about philosophers. Who's up, who's down, who's in love, who's not, honors received, denied, deserved, ill-gotten. You can be sure that on the lip of the cave around the ancient campfire, our tribal ancestors were gossiping. For what do we live, wrote Jane Austen, but to make sport for our neighbors and laugh at them in our turn? The love of spectacle is no less endearing. Children adore sparkle, glitter, and hullabaloo. We condescend to them because of it, but we like it just as much. We don't outgrow spectacle. We just call it something else. Or if we should outgrow it and develop a sort of dour Puritanism, we will have sadly lost some sense of play and imaginative zest. You'll find an unapologetic love for spectacle throughout early civilizations and the ancient world, the best known instance being, of course, the gladiatorial and other contests in the Roman Colosseum. And I myself love all historical costume dramas, even dreadful, silly, inaccurate, kitschy ones, for reasons I can't really explain. Russell Crowe, and I'm about to talk about Russell Crowe, but I thought it was Mel Gibson. I told my wife, gee, I really thought Mel Gibson was great in The Gladiators. Mel Gibson? She said, you are so hopeless. You're going to talk to them about celebrity? Anyway, Russell Crowe in Gladiator, which was not a serious work of art, I assure you, and I know it, he made a spectacle of spectacle, which for me, that's catnip. I know there's better stuff, but spectacle, it's okay with me. Our instinctive love of spectacle can also tap something deep, awakening our senses to things more important than spectacle. A cathedral is many things, not least of which is an architectural spectacle, and a place for spectacles to be staged. The High Roman Mass is spectacle in part. So are Hindu festivals or the Mexican Day of the Dead. Many great artists of the Renaissance, this is not much known, but many great artists of the Renaissance spent more time creating whimsical court festivals, transient secular surface concoctions, whimsical court festivals, now mostly lost to us. They spent more time doing that than painting the pictures for which they are today remembered. I would not look down on a Leonardo confection. The expression of play, the love of play in a dangerous world can have an existential force. Power finds spectacle like gossip useful. The famous Roman observation about controlling the urban crowd, give them bread and circuses, is usually presented as an implicit criticism of the Roman mob and the decay in Rome of civic virtue and restraint. Cynical politicians could control the witless mob merely by filling their stomachs with bread and their heads with cheap thrills. Our own day certainly did not discover the political uses of spectacle. During her so-called royal progressions, Queen Elizabeth, coated in jewels, surrounded by hundreds of horsemen in fine armor, intentionally awed her subjects. Louis XIV famously subdued his nobles by making a spectacle of himself and of court life at Versailles. Now, the love of status, like that of gossip and spectacle, is also an ineradicable part of the human makeup. Evolutionary psychologists are paying increasing attention to the quest for status as one of our defining traits. You find it, of course, in all mammals. We would like as a human animal to think that we are above such things. And Missoula may be less status conscious than LA, and there are some among us, bless them, who are indifferent to status and the status game. But most people don't just want to be admired. They want to be envied. What toys they have matters less than that their toys are as good as or better than yours. It is not enough to succeed, the writer Gore Vidal once said, a man as cynical as any I've ever read or met. It is not enough to succeed, others must fail. Even in a monastery, you can be confident there will be a competition for saintly status. That is, who has the fewest toys, appears most indifferent to clothes, cares least about money and worldly success. The struggle for status is, in fact, the great subject of satire from ancient times onwards. I would have loved to hear Molière, for example, define the difference between A-list and B-list celebrities. Is that like sort of a potato chip and an organic potato chip? I don't know. But you must give the struggle for status this practical use. It can create movement and improvement in the human condition. Anxiety over status can serve as a goad to achievement. If everyone's status were settled, a religious and social aspiration of many cultures, including medieval Christianity and Hinduism, would anything ever change? What I am suggesting is that celebrity culture has not been foisted upon us. Lindsay Lohan and the horrific Donald Trump are not grotesque aberrations. The fault, to paraphrase and misuse Shakespeare, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. And yet still, something obviously happened in the modern age to change the game, to enhance, elevate, and exaggerate our natural proclivities in this area. What had been contained, kept close in a royal court or a small town, exploded outwards. I'm not going to recount the history of celebrity in much detail, but its evolution can be roughly separated, I think, into two broad periods. The first begins in the 18th century with the accelerating development of our modern secular society. This period ends, and the second begins, in my view, around the time of Warhol's death in 1987, which is also about when computers and the internet began to dominate and celebrity culture went viral. In the first period, traditional social boundaries loosened. Status became more fluid, creating as a result more anxiety about status. The individual became more important, both as a consumer and as an individual. He stood out more, less defined than he once was by birth or class. Cities began to expand rapidly, creating an urban flux. Money, fashion, and interest in travel spread to the middle class. Most important of all, the middle class learned to read. Hucksters, pamphleteers, advertisers, revolutionaries, critics, gossips, and scandalmongers, in other words, the press, developed a market by reaching out to an ever-expanding audience of new consumers. New products, ideas, and gossip traveled more quickly. As religious certainties decayed and meaning itself became more open-ended, haphazard, and volatile, many writers and artists began to fill in the gaps or the blanks with an emphasis on private experience, unmediated by church, ritual, or class. Romantic love, melancholy reverie, the contemplation of an untamed and exotic nature, the losing of oneself in scandalous novels, these became powerful impulses, fertile ground, I would say, for the love of gossip, spectacle, and shifting status. Some people think of Lord Byron, who died in 1824, as the first modern celebrity. Here's how one writer not long ago described the publication of his poem, Childe Harold, quote, "But there was never a more mocking essay and mock heroic. Byron took up the genre of Pope and turned it into true confessions. It was plain as day that the poem described innumerable sexual escapades of its author. He was a lord of the realm, darkly curly-haired, dazzling and dashing, and daring with an illusion, a courtly compliment, or an insolent excuse. Add to all that a withered calf muscle which shortened his leg and twisted his foot inwards, and his romantic uniform, his masterful nature, and his winsome appeal could not be bettered. A star. Not many people in England actually knew Byron, yet everybody thought they knew Byron. Not just his name, not just his rank, not just his family, not just his poetry. They thought they knew his heart, and that was new. Schoolgirls, let alone aristocrats, thought they knew Byron's heart. The critic Richard Schickel coined an oxymoron that I like, quote, intimate strangers, that captures this developing paradox of celebrity culture. In the 19th and 20th century, gossip and spectacle, love and status, once quite personal, became something, in addition to personal, something abstract. In its abstraction, it became a kind of product that could be widely disseminated. The abstraction describes a distance, the distance between the performer and an audience that's no longer physically present. That's intangible. Byron performed, but what? He seemed to perform his life, his poetry, his love affairs. He made a spectacle of himself, and he was the subject of constant gossip. We're talking in the 1820s now. His status did not seem quite earthbound, but transcended social rank or public position. In the distance between the performer and the mass audience lay an interesting new space, a kind of emptiness, a metaphysical hollowing out. A life performed could be truly felt, of course, but could also be a manufactured surface, an invention. In the distance between performer and mass audience, two important qualities that are traditionally part of all the imaginative arts, scale and touch, began to change. Poetry and drama originally began around the fire, of course, as a spoken art, intimate, the words full of touch and rhyme. In the move from the mouth to the printed word, scale and touch changed, remaining intimate perhaps, but again, more abstract, filtered, mediated. Still more so in the move towards the televised image. What scale should things be in this abstracted space between performer and audience? How should the elements fit, or should they fit at all? Did they need to fit? How should they touch? And what is touch to be now? Not surprisingly, entrepreneurs in the marketplace, in fashion, in the arts, in politics, in fame itself, soon realized there was money to be made here, and bigger was often better. Some scholars refer to this process of abstraction and hollowing out as a commodification. Some use the phrase, the industrialization of fame. Now, there was all along resistance for many quarters to the development of celebrity culture and the kind of hollowing out it fosters. For most of this first period, serious high art maintained an important place in the resistance. Artists might do scandalous things, provoke and titillate. They might become famous or hustle their way to fame, but their best work was nevertheless thought to represent and protect serious value, to embody a tradition through the creation of significant form, of complexity and richness of meaning. From about the middle of the 19th century, artists were often treated as morally superior outsiders, the famous avant-garde, whose work challenged the middle-class mainstream and its weakness for making money and enjoying crass entertainment. This view of artists was dominant through the 1950s, and some today still believe contemporary artists offer a powerful resistance to the mainstream. But then there's Andy Warhol. Maybe we should have the first slide here of Andy, the light. The first period of celebrity culminates in Andy Warhol, who transformed himself into the symbol, the very avatar of celebrity. The actual pictures Warhol made are, I think, the least of his achievement. His earlier pop works, especially the soup cans, the car crashes and electric chairs, some of the silkscreen portraits, have a minor interest as pictures. But he was, in my view, no more than a gifted illustrator when it came to make a picture you hung on the wall. He began as a commercial illustrator. In fact, he was particularly good at women's shoes. No, his great achievement was not making images for the wall, but the image he made of himself. Like Byron, he was a performer, and surely his own greatest work of art. I'd bet every single one of you can call to mind right now his image, and in case you can't, there he is. A blonde wig, the blonde wig, a man strangely bleached with an expression at once vacant and waiting, eager for the next event, the next spectacle. I'm not going to show you his soup cans or his Marylands, you know them anyway. Just Andy himself, Andy, the Andy doll, I call him, because he's what really matters. Warhol is the perfect symbol for the age of celebrity, at once exhibitionist and voyeur, audience and star, so narcissistic in his projection that he resembles one of those creatures that can mate with itself, generating a perfect copy. He liked to attend parties of the image comics. I like that too. He liked to attend parties of the image conscious, carrying a camera around his neck, at once watching and watched, making pictures and becoming the picture. He called his studio the factory, and I doubt he was being merely ironic. He certainly enjoyed demystifying and desanctifying the holy aura of the studio, emptying it of its romantic associations as a place where the spirit found form. He liked the industrial quality of a studio called the factory. He liked commodifying fame. He liked a quasi-industrial process like silkscreen lithography. He liked having lots of workers to help make new pictures for sale and to gossip around the water cooler. He loved nothing more than spectacle. His trademark response was the almost speechless reverence of, wow. No, and I put much too much affect in that. It was sort of, wow. No, too much. Wow. Maybe that's better. I mean, no affect. Somehow, it's very hard to do. You might try it. Say wow, so it's just flat. He started a magazine called Interview, devoted in a hip way to stargazing and gossip. The world was nothing more than an enormous screen on which to watch people gossip, become famous or not famous, give their acts a shot. American Idol indeed. Warhol was there first. As an artist-performer, he was entirely unapologetic about his actions. I say unapologetic because, as I just mentioned, a quasi-religious sanctity still attached to the creation of art, at least through the 1950s. Picasso might have known his way around a stage and made a spectacle of himself, but Picasso was still thought to stand fundamentally outside and apart from Philistine culture. He was a genius, not just a star. Even Marcel Duchamp, who in some respects is Warhol's essential precursor, had a kind of aristocratic remove, a smile that, while not that of a moralist, was wryly skeptical. Not just wow. See, I didn't say it right again. Warhol spectacularly abandoned, in short, the moralizing distinction between the artist and a corrupt society. He had no time for art's memory or for earlier details, which he considered old hat or at most cute. Nor did he have time for an art that aspired to create something beyond surface effects, though he might allow such a work a wow. You can sense in his person, in his very person, the scale of celebrity. You can see what has happened to the body and to touch. Warhol loved a beautiful surface. He loved a gorgeous person. He loved sex, in fact, to watch, not do. He loved sex as a performance, a spectacle, an occasion for gossip. And yet people wondered, and still wonder, if he really meant it. I'm sure none of you think he could really, how could someone really mean this? Was the performance ironic? Was he a closet satirist? The thing I like best about Warhol, what I think is truly brilliant, is this strange uncertainty about his intention. He played it so close until the end, and with such unyielding conviction that no one can ever be quite sure about his intentions. Perhaps he himself was not certain and let the ambiguity hang there to trouble the future. If he had given us any doubts, anything robust or red-blooded, he would have left behind nothing as powerful as this extraordinary image of celebrity man. Since Warhol's death in 1987, we have entered a new or second stage of celebrity culture. Nothing has fundamentally changed, but celebrity culture has been, for lack of a better word, supercharged. Facebook and Twitter are, in a way, Warhol's offspring. The virtual community of the net is the home he built but did not live to see. The very idea of a reality show where there is no reality that is not performed is pure Warhol, as are 15 minutes of fame earned by the people who fret, sing, and dance on American Idol. They always have to seem to suffer, to sort of perform a kind of suffering. The experience of the computer and the internet are now moving deeply into our consciousness in a way that affects each and every one of us. There's no escape entirely, especially ambitious artists who work with what a society gives them. What is happening in this new emerging stage of celebrity culture? Consider first just what's happening to the light. Let me just get a drink here. To the light that we live with. In the old days, for most of human history, of course, sun and darkness, maybe candles if you were rich. Then oil lamps, which flicker and shadow in a kind of interesting way. Black and white photography, poor analog color, early color photographs. Jasper Johns, I interviewed him one time, and he told me he grew up in a small town in the South, and he saw a book of Picasso's, about Picasso in the library, the local library, fell in love with Picasso's work. He couldn't wait to get to New York first, so he rushes to New York. He's, I don't know, maybe 17 or 18. And he rushes to the Museum of Modern Art to look at the Picassos, and he sees them and he says, "Oh my God, these are the ugliest things I've ever seen." Because he was used to the images. And you can imagine what's happening to us with our digital color. Anyway, our light now is very often a computer light, a computer screen light. Now this is a very interesting light. I was talking a bit about it at lunch today. I tried to get a matte screen for an Apple. They stopped making matte screens. You can only get the shiny screen, the glossy screen, where the color is so saturated, so goosed up and juicy that it addicts you the way sugar does. It's not like color, other color. It's not like outdoors color. It's a very special thing. And the light is not coming any longer from outside you, whether it's the sun or even electric light. It's not coming from inside you. It's not a metaphysical light. It's coming from inside the box. And we spend all day looking into light that's coming from inside this box, a very special kind of light. I don't know if you've seen those images, which I've seen on the internet, of course, of how the Earth looks now from space, the light, and the light that's being beamed up into space. In many places, not in Montana, of course, but in many places, certainly New York, you can no longer see stars. So you could imagine what that does to people finally. You lose stars up there, you're going to enjoy the stars down here. There's even I read that there's a chance that people will be able to advertise in space, so that you could be going out to camp in Glacier National Park or something, and you'll look up, you'll want to look up and see whatever you see up there, and what you'll see, instead of the pearly gates, you'll see the golden gates, or Starbucks in the sky. It's possible technically to do this. Something similar has happened to sound, of course. We've lost silence just as we've lost the night. One of my daughters says she can't concentrate without noise. If we go somewhere and it's very, very quiet, she says, "I can't think." The sense of time, too, scattered, fractured, staccato. Memory is not remembered, but found on Google search. You can't sink into time anymore. Well, now, if you were an artist, and this is the situation, what would you make of it? What reflections would you take from the light around you if you wanted to tell the truth about your surroundings? Not surprisingly, many photographers today work with light boxes, images where the light is buried inside. I'm going to show you now the work of 3 artists who I believe make a perfect fit with today's celebrity culture and have, in turn, become, if not famous in the mass media, A-list celebrities in art. The first is John Curran, a painter who frankly doesn't interest me much at all. His strategy and performance is to match an old master veneer, typically one, here it has an echoes with Northern European Adam and Eve pictures, Northern European Renaissance art, with a cartoonish, often sexually charged imagery. The saucy look of these girls, that is he tries to be as politically incorrect as possible, which attracts attention. He became best known, for example, by painting Playboy-like bimbos with enormous breasts in an old masterish way. Critics sometimes call him a social satirist, as they sometimes call Warhol an implicit critic of his society. But I can't regard Curran as a satirist. Barbie and Playboy are old and easy targets. A fresh-eyed satirist would be more likely to be lampooning Curran himself. No, Curran's game is to be a safe bad boy who creates a spectacle that must be seen partly because his work seems slightly scandalous, but not really scandalous, and very knowing and smart, a marriage between old master technique and salacious pop imagery. In interviews, Curran tries to outrage the public by confessing that his main desire is not to be a great painter, or even a good one, but to be famous. That's a Warhol riff, of course, to be honestly inauthentic and therefore authentic, and get paid for it. He acts as a conservative, trying to say, again, politically incorrect things in the New York Times, but the New York Times has done nothing but write, in large measure, rapturous pieces about him. You should all look up a recent society piece about John Curran in the New York Times, which is called, it's him and his wife, and it's called Their Own Best Creations, and it's just a valentine to John Curran. And the most interesting thing about it all is that the writer had a perfect opportunity to engage in at least a little satire and never did. Marina Abramovich, whom I like better, is a performance artist whose retrospective last year at the Museum of Modern Art in New York caused a sensation. It was called The Artist is Present. 2 of her pieces in that show caused particular comment. In the first, she would sit in the atrium of the museum, this piece, for many hours at a time. Visitors to the museum, an audience of a kind, would line up for the chance to sit opposite her at the table, where Abramovich and the visitor would then stare at each other while being stared at by a large crowd. You had to be there. Many of the viewers waited for hours to sit at the table with her, and then sat at the table with her for hours. I have no doubt that quite a few of you think this is idiotic, absurd, and certainly not art. Well, you're right that it is not the art that we know from the tradition of painting. It is instead part of the dominant strain of art in our own time, which stems not from painting, but from Dada and absurdist theater. In this tradition, which is a great tradition, artists, rather than use a brush, take actions, create situations, or make existential gestures that are intended to reveal or capture something important about us and our society. Sometimes they do that well, sometimes not. This particular Abramovich performance was certainly a spectacle. It generated amazing gossip and art chat. The museum was mobbed with people quietly staring at 2 people staring. Whatever their ultimate judgment of the work, these people who came to look, including me, I doubt they will ever forget it. And why did they watch? Why? What was so captivating about it? By the way, you see the photographer there. That's sort of an artsy, craftsy shot of the piece. Usually there were all these kids, young people sort of sitting down just watching on the edges. Well, I think the spectacle certainly captures something about intimate strangers, doesn't it, that phrase, and leads to reflections about narcissism, surely the main psychic disease of our time, and personal connection. Abramovich does not regard herself as a narcissist. Narcissists never do. But I was fascinated that she always came dramatically dressed, as she is here. With her hair, looking quite extraordinary. Usually you can't see it here, but it's long and it would flow down over the red dress. She almost always looked much more interesting than the visitor. I mean, you can see who's more interesting there. Who wins? The person across from her, drawn in effect from the abstract mass, was granted his or her 15 minutes in the limelight. The voyeur exhibitionist theme I mentioned earlier in relation to our society in general, and Warhol in particular, is here complexly rendered. The fact that the 2 people are silent and largely motionless is also provocative. Silence is telling in a world of noise. And what, finally, is Abramovich suggesting about human relationships here? Are we all finally strangers to one another, even when we stare into each other's eyes? Or is she rediscovering something we often forget in celebrity culture, that a blink can communicate as much as a shout? And why did she call her retrospective The Artist is Present? Could that perhaps have had something to do with what is and is not authentic? Have we made a fetish of the artist person, a fetish of art as a sign of the authentic? I could go on and on with this kind of talk, but I must tell you, in addition to the philosophical ruminations, I may think too much sometimes, but in addition to that, I also found this piece comic. Perhaps I was the only person in New York who found it funny. It reminded me of the children's game of staring to see who laughs first, a game I usually won. I kept wanting the person across from Abramovich to pull out a lemon and start chewing, sort of like a gag on the Little Rascals, to see if she would actually crack a smile. I don't believe she would. She's very good at what she does. But the fact that this piece provoked me and that I continue to think about it means that I cannot simply dismiss it. The second Abramovich work that caused great comment was a kind of narrow doorway or passage created by two naked people, two naked standing living pillars. Visitors to the show were invited to walk between these two naked bodies in order to pass from one room to the next. The two figures, in this case it's sort of safer because it's two women, but the two figures were usually a man and a woman, stood very close together, facing each other, silent, unmoving, and expressionless. No expression in Abramovich. To pass between them, you had to sidle through sideways because there was not enough space otherwise, and there was definitely some chance of contact. In fact, I stepped on her toes. No expression when I did. Now, this is clearly a diverting spectacle and easily dismissed, if you want to dismiss it, as a shameless headline-grabbing act. And yet, like her other piece, it raises provocative questions about the issues I've been discussing: narcissism, spectacle, exhibitionism, voyeurism, the physical body, and touch. How do these bodies differ from the nudes we look at paintings? There were many naked bodies in Abramovich's show, not just these, and she instructed the models to always remain still and expressionless. I found it interesting that the bodies thereby became almost entirely unerotic and unsensual. There's an old riff in modernist culture and horror movies, B-horror movies, in which mannequins suddenly spring to life. Here, living bodies subside into mannequinism, except not quite. Something about the body and the way our culture makes intimate abstractions from the body was being conveyed in this piece. I spent some time watching how visitors chose to pass between the two bodies. In each case I observed, the visitors, male and female, chose to face the female. Make of that what you will. The third artist, here's another, that's another shot of it showing you the space you had to negotiate. A lot of people, well, not a lot, most people felt intimidated into doing it even though they didn't want to do it. The third artist, who in my view is a perfect fit in today's celebrity culture, is Damien Hirst. As most of you know, he is a remarkable provocateur, creating in the art world both intense loathing and strong support. He's best known for creating vitrines filled with formaldehyde that contain dead animals, cows, sharks, lambs, and so on. The animals are usually placed upright, so they have a ghostly, almost lifelike aspect. Hirst is also known for his creation of medicine cabinets that can have about them a deadly fluorescence, the formaldehyde of light, and they contain a wide selection of pills. He has exhibited paintings too, which are painted by others in his workshop, another riff on authenticity, and most recently he appalled much of the world by fashioning a skull made of 8,601 diamonds, called For the Love of God, for which he asked $100 million. He didn't find an immediate buyer, but he developed a consortium of corporate buyers who bought this piece for investment. I don't think the price is released, but it was probably close to $100 million for, there's his shark, for this. It is very difficult for a serious painter to even think about a person like Damien Hirst as an artist. Like Abramovich, he stems mainly from the Dada tradition, although he owns a substantial debt, which he acknowledges and emphasizes to the English painter Francis Bacon. Hirst, like Warhol, whom he also acknowledges, is very good at taking advantage of what he may or may not be satirizing, or playing the irony game. The diamond skull, with its circle of investors, seems a calculated transformation of death into cash and celebrity, a symbol of the greed of our era and the corruption at the heart of the art world. Or is Hirst making a picture, even as he grows very rich, of exactly that greed and corruption, having his cake and eat it too? Is his image of death deadpan, in other words? Similarly, the dead animals in the vitrines seem, from one perspective, a disgusting spectacle designed to attract attention, the reductio ad absurdum of the old modernist impulse to overturn expectations and shock conventional taste. But is, on the other hand, he making a devastating image of our cruel treatment of animals? Is he savagely commemorating with his formaldehyde the industrialization of agriculture and the grim materialistic attitude of modern science? Is he commemorating a lost sense of touch of the physical? The vitrines recall those jars in which lost or aborted fetuses were once kept for study to be sure, but also to titillate. Next year, by the way, just to show you the kind of mainstream he stands in, the English government, the Tate Britain, or maybe it might be Tate Modern, but anyway, the National Important Museum in London, at the time of the Olympics, is mounting a major retrospective of Damien Hirst. So you're going to have athletic bodies and Hirst bodies. Really, talk about a spectacle of the flesh. Huh? I find it interesting that death haunts so much of this art. Warhol and Hirst are clearly both obsessed with death. Abramovich, too, has made work about political massacres and ethnic cleansings. It seems to me natural that artists who are serious about the reflections of celebrity culture would grow fascinated with the death of the body and the failure of the flesh. The hollowing out of meaning, the emphasis on surface, the obsession with money, the celebration of the perfect body, for these things, death serves as the necessary foil. A tension, a contrast. It is the counterpoint to glossy computer screens and the strategic performance. Hirst's skull calls to mind the important tradition in religious painting in which a figure, often a hermit, meditates upon a skull in order to keep in mind the transience of life and the promise of a glorious afterlife. But Hirst does not believe in the afterlife. He believes in 15 minutes. So instead of the light of heaven, we get the sparkle of diamonds. Warhol himself, as the image I showed you before suggests, resembled a specter, a ghost. Will Warhol's 15 minutes ever come to an end? Possibly, if we undergo a genuine social crisis, a transformative one, probably of great pain, that makes Warhol seem by contrast trivial, mannered, yesterday's news, unserious to present circumstances. But I'm not holding my breath. At the moment, Andy's very much alive. You'll have noticed, however, that I still have many reservations about celebrity culture, although I believe it's a proper subject for art. I think the Andy doll is an extraordinary creation, a work of genius, a truly emblematic figure, but I also want to resist and challenge it. I don't really like it. And there are many people like me in the world, and in the art world too, who stand apart somewhat from celebrity culture. The resistance has to feel, in both the world at large and among artists, like a minority taste. Pop culture and music, Hollywood, Facebook, Twitter, the rest, these obviously control the scene. But other forms of expression survive and sometimes flourish. You can also find this minority's perspective, not just in the arts, by the way, but also in our social and economic life, where some businessmen and people who work on the land resist and challenge, for example, our dominant way of doing business and farming. Microbreweries, for which Missoula and the Northwest are known, instead of Budweiser. A strawberry that tastes like a strawberry that you only eat in June, rather than a factory berry from California. Where art is concerned, I'd like to distinguish between two kinds of resistance to the dominant trend. One is plainly reactionary, ostrich-like, head in the sand. It simply ignores a world it finds disagreeable, or if it notices that world at all, dismisses it in a self-congratulatory manner, as in, you may spend your time with this effluvia, but I am with Mozart. Or, if less high-minded, a reactionary will simply copy and repeat what has been done in the past, creating nostalgic and sentimental concoctions like pictures of sad cowboys or Indians looking into the sunset. That always really goes over well in Montana, but, you know. Reactionaries frequently romanticize and fetishize the past, ignoring its rough and unpretty qualities. Anglophiles can be like that. I know that very well. They love only a certain aspect of England and ignore the rest, because people with this perspective are very good at leaving out much of the world. Their work tends to become thin as a consequence, precious, mannered, unnourished by challenge, slack, no tension, no difficulty, none of the oxygen of the present. There are exceptions, I think. There are pure reactionaries who become kind of magnificent cranks or hermits, and they make wonderful idiosyncratic art. The Italian still life painter Alberto Morandi was like that, and a friend of mine, an Israeli painter and Holocaust survivor, Victor Rica, who recently died, he mounted a wonderful battle in art and conversation against our time. In general, though, I'm interested in a richer, more complex response or resistance to celebrity culture and its manifestations. As I said earlier, a love for spectacle is part of our nature. It is possible to like both Oedipus and the Super Bowl. Mozart and U2 are not enemies. Artists who remain open in this way, whose deepest sympathies may not lie with our moment, but who remain engaged with the present, often suffer from the fear that they're minor. In other words, that they work in history's backwater and are not confronting and embodying the great contemporary themes and practices of their time, and they may have a point. I'm not sure. You could as easily argue that Damien Hirst, rather than a radical provocateur, is in the great modernist tradition, rather than a provocateur in the great modernist tradition of original invention, is instead the mannerist representative of an ossified and conservative establishment taste, as witness is embraced by the English establishment in London. How could he not be? You could argue, furthermore, that it may one day be precisely those who resist the present by remembering the past who embody what's truly radical and offer a way for future art. The great innovations of the Renaissance were stimulated by a desire to recover the classical past, to develop memory, in short. In art, one often moves ahead by looking back. The anxiety over major and minor is, up to a point, a useful spur to artists, but it's largely, I think, irrelevant. Almost no one is major, including those celebrated in their day as major. And an artist cannot create his or her own sensibility from scratch in order to fit smoothly into a set of contemporary circumstances. There are many things, perhaps the best things, an artist simply cannot help if he or she is honest. You have the work of such an artist on view right now, for example, in Missoula, Lori Fendrick. She's a woman a New York painter who knows all about contemporary fashion, taste, and current aesthetic theory. Yet she makes paintings, because she is honest and cannot help herself, that depend largely upon a rather narrow early 20th century tradition of painted modernist abstraction. That's what suits her, even if it's not the ticket now. Her work displays few of the qualities of celebrity culture. To give you just one example, there is nothing quick or illustrational in her pictures. She slowly builds up her surfaces and fine-tunes her edges. Her art requires study, concentration, and time. They don't take 15 minutes to make or to see. And if you go to see this show, which I certainly hope you will, don't feel obliged to look at all of the paintings. Don't graze. People go to museums and they graze like cattle, this thing, this, and they don't stop. You don't need to look at all the pictures. Look at 3 or 4 of them hard for a while and see if anything happens. Yet Fendrick is not lost to the present. Something in her color also reflects the contemporary, and a love for caricature and the comic enters rather discreetly and rather wittily in her forms. I myself am rather like Lori. I resist celebrity culture partly because of my experience in Montana. I don't think of Montana, as I suggested at the outset, as an alternative, a refuge, or a prelapsarian paradise. What Montana provides is a certain real-world mixture of elements that I myself require and can't help. And one of those is actually a vivid sense of contemporary celebrity culture, that element of the showman. I've always been aware, perhaps because I'm both an outsider and an insider in Montana, that there is a play or a pretend Montana, a performed Montana. This Montana is obsessed with authenticity and what it means to be authentic. Cowboys, dudes, hats, guns, pickups, chew, Buffalo Bill, the Western mythology generally is often the least of it. How many times have you heard, he's a 4th-generation Montanan? What does this really mean? Are you less interesting if you're merely a 2nd-generation Montanan? Is there an aristocracy here? A genealogy of Western virtue? Who owns this franchise? Why must the pilgrim from California be laughed at? And what if you're a 757th-generation Indian? Or is it Native American? Or is it Crow? Or is it Abscorky? Or, one more example, those postcard pictures, now nicely goosed and juiced up with Photoshop, of weather-beaten barns, one-room schoolhouses, and log cabins settled into the Purple Mountains' majesty. I know some houses like that, and I also know the little cemeteries near them. When I see picturesque photographs of those buildings, the real estate of nostalgia, I always want to know as well what happened offstage to the homesteaders. Very hard, very hard. You can enjoy the phrase, the last best place, while also acknowledging that it's become a brand, a celebrity brand. The brand is authenticity in a competitive celebrity culture, a Montana brand, and very abstract. But Montana has also given me two things, along with that contemporary sense of showmanship, which are not abstract in the way that Warhol or Hearst are abstract. I would, from earliest childhood, come to my grandfather's place in the summer, before I knew about irony, that is, or corny nature photography. The visionary quality of the landscape, the mountains, the raking morning light, the sunsets, the shifting space of the high plains, was something I couldn't ignore. And now it is something I can't help. It has forced me, sometimes against my will, to respect the presentation of an ideal in art, which is anything but Warholian. Montana ultimately is why I insist upon Malevich, Mondrian, Rothko, Agnes Martin, and certain abstract painters. At the same time, as a child, I was also directly confronted in Montana with something that was neither abstract nor ideal, but no less captivating. Something I also can't escape today, and that is the rough and the visceral, especially the visceral, touch, the tactile, not just horse sweat and the like, but a sense in my bones of fleshy vulnerability, calves dead of dust pneumonia, a deer tangled up in barbed wire, the butchering of chickens. Once during a plague of ground squirrels, we called them gophers then, I was 11 or 12, a couple of guys told me to come shooting with them. One drove, the other two stood in back with .22s, snap-shooting gophers peeking out from their holes. I remember the soft sound a bullet makes when it hits, and blood trailing down a hole. Horrible, but not diamonds in a skull. Not a lamb in formaldehyde. Not an Andy doll. Not, that is, abstract. In the Montana I Can't Help, the ideal and the visceral, a sensation and an intimation, are intertwined in the neighborhood of showbiz. I like the tension, the unstable mixture. It doesn't resolve in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Before Mr. Stevens goes in the back in the lobby to sell books and sign them for us, he'll do some Q&A. And we have two microphones, one in each aisle. If you'll approach the mic if you have a question.
I don't have a question, but an observation that might be useful to you. I think it was in the early 70s. The student lecture series here brought what they thought was Andy Warhol. I had seen him, I didn't go to the lecture. The next day in the Kaiman, our campus newspaper, there was a picture of the lecture. It was not Andy Warhol. He was 20 years younger, dyed blonde, about the same height, but not Andy Warhol. This was revealed that his whole lecture tour was done by this young man. About 10 days later, it was revealed he returned the money, but he said he was disappointed because he thought this young man, that we'd gotten what we'd paid for, he was really more Andy Warhol than Andy Warhol was.
I like that. That's a very Warholian story.
Let's see, I think I have something good written here. Do you believe stardom essentially a degree of showmanship?
I'm not understanding. Would you just speak slowly?
Yes, I apologize. Do you believe stardom essentially a degree of showmanship and commercialism when added to a perfect, complete work of art such as Montana destroys the perfection?
I'm not, one thing that de Kooning taught me, I'm naturally a purist. That's my instinctive and native taste. And I've intentionally put myself in the way of artists who are not like that, like de Kooning and like Francis Bacon now. And what I've learned from that is, it's a way of putting myself in a position of stress and anxiety, which I like for some reason. And I don't really believe in an artist's life or an artist's sensibility being pure. I believe I believe that it is in contrast impure and should be impure. That doesn't mean that you can't aspire towards a particularly pure kind of art. But I think you cannot in an a priori way deduce that just mentally. I mean, maybe a few people can, saints perhaps, but I think that artists who are definitely not saints need the rough and tumble, they need impurity, they need struggle, they need anxiety. So I find that this Montana landscape, and I don't really like when you say that it's a work of art. It's certainly a magnificent thing, but art is made by people, and it's not. Well, I suppose some people would say art is made by God, but I don't think that's the case. I think art is a struggle maybe to reach God sometimes, but it's made by people. It's not something out there. And if it's made by people, it's made under conditions of, if it's any good, I think, it's made under conditions of intense psychic pressure. And so as I said, I'm not sure I quite understood your question, but I think that the mixture of elements in Montana, including the ersatz, including the phony, including the fakery, I like all of that. I like it all mixed up together. I don't think it's necessary to take a ruler and cut things off and parse them up or make a grammar of perfection or anything like that. I think it's very hard to make good art, and you need to just open yourself up to what's going on, reject, but you need to stay open. Anyway, I'm babbling.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. When you spoke about Montana art and those desolate farms and barns and one-room schoolhouses, and you asked, I thought, a very intriguing question. What's happening off stage? What's happening off camera? And as you raised that question, I thought about the art historian Arnold Hauser, who in a famous book called The Social History of Art, wrote that without an understanding of the social and economic and political issues that define a moment in history, the art of that period is really unknowable at its deepest level of historical meaning. And I wonder if your lecture tonight really has been a call for us to think about art beyond the level of aesthetics and to really place art in a much more historical context that really requires us to know about the general history of a period, not just the art history, but the political, economic, and social history as well.
That's a complex question, Professor Drake, that we got into a bit this afternoon. My view is that yes, things are becoming much too specialized for artists too. They go to school in art, they don't necessarily read other things, they become specialists in art rather than specialists in life now. And I would agree with you that I think that great artists have a relationship, usually, to the past that is deep and significant, and they work within a tradition, even to abuse it and misunderstand it. But they're at least aware of the tradition, and they submit to it to a degree. Gorky, one of my favorite artists, he spent years just making copies because he wanted, in that old-time way, to understand how Picasso did it, how Miro did it. And he was basically submitting himself as a student, disciple to a great tradition, not just a particular artist. And he learned an enormous amount by that, and then he was able to do his own work that was very original after that. As I said before, the idea of, in an abstracted, self-conscious way, saying, I need to know more about social and political life, I need to do this, I just don't think that's how it actually works with making art. That's not how artists really are, you know. They have lots of opinions, especially young artists. They have lots of opinions, and they have views the way anyone else does. but they're not abstract in that way ordinarily. You know, they do things they can't help. They try to learn, they put themselves in awkward positions, but they don't, in an abstracted way, do what you describe. In the old days, studios, when artists would go into a studio and learn from a master, something like that did happen, I think. I think the master could force that. In our culture now, it's very hard to do that. I'm not against it. De Kooning, you know, he thought everyone should just draw from the cast when they were young, and then, as Rubens said, then maybe put in their own dimples later. But learn how to do it. Possess the tradition first. Your other point about only by really understanding the past can you understand its works of art. I think you can, I would say yes and no. I think it's always good to understand the past, but you can be, I've seen such ignorance by people who understood the cultural and social context of 200 years ago, say. They have no eye, they can't see, they have no sense of what it is to be a young artist struggling, they have no passion, their souls are desiccated, but they know that this person went to the school there and that there was an economic bust then and that the price of bread was this. They know all that, and they say, see, the art is like that. But they don't know, they don't have an eye, they don't see it. So I think it's completely possible, for example, to, I mean, art, you know, I'll tell you a little story. I started writing plays for some bizarre reason, and I had my first one I've only done this recently, I just had the first one read by very good actors at the New York Theater Workshop. It was, for me, an astounding experience for the following reason. I thought that when you wrote a play, this is about misunderstanding the past. I thought that when you wrote a play, what happens is if they like it, they put it on, and that's that. Sort of like being a writer. You finish your book, you send it out, people read it, or they don't. What I didn't realize is that it's all misunderstanding and chaos. Your play, you have a sense in your head of what the words sound like, and it's never what it sounded like to you when someone else says it. They're putting their own spin on it. Sometimes they improve it, sometimes they save you, sometimes they don't. But you realize that, oh my gosh, you think people understand what you're saying. The amount of misunderstanding is simply unbelievable. So we muddle along, and we find our way. And misunderstanding, a lot of great art has happened because living artists almost intentionally misunderstand the past. That's how they escape from the past, because they need to do that too. So especially they always misunderstand the generation before them. So that Warhol and his bunch, they wouldn't give anything to the abstract expressionists. They just made fun of them. That's because they were afraid of them. That's because they needed to find their own space. So they willfully misunderstood the past. And then they went to sort of cold mannerist art, way in the past. And they sort of used that as a way to describe what they were doing historically sometimes. But were they really understanding cold, that the mannerist art of the 16th century? I don't think so. They were using it. Artists need to, when they work, they're looking for stuff to use, for a way to make something that somehow works, and it's really hard to make it work. So they're not abstract people. They might make abstract art, but they don't think in that sort of, usually in that sort of academic way. Well, again, I'm babbling, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.
One more? Yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks for being here. I want to be a famous celebrity artist. What should I do?
Buy a wig.
I have one. No, just kidding.
Well, it's harder than you think. That's the funny part. It seems very easy what Warhol did, but it was very original. Even Damien Hirst, who gives me the willies, really, you have to hand it to him on some level. He has made an enormous splash. How do you do that? You have to, as Professor Drake was saying, I think you have to really understand what makes your time tick. And Damien Hirst, he does. He knows how to push the buttons. In English society particularly, but he knows how to push collectors' buttons. I mean, the skull, the only thing that is human on this is the teeth. All the rest is diamonds. Now, horrifying, but also, now that you've seen it, now that you've thought about it, I bet you're not going to forget it, especially that it cost $100 million. I mean, if he charged $20 million for it, maybe he wouldn't be famous. If he charged $100 million, you know what you have to create scandal, gossip, and talk. And I'm no good at that. I mostly sit alone, not talking, staring at my computer screen. So I'm not out there figuring out how to do this stuff. You tell me.
Thank you.
My turn.
Go ahead.
So I want to say that your biography is not just the best artist biography, but the best biography I've ever read. But I need some clarification here. So what do you mean by corny color photography, landscape photography?
Uh-oh. I wish this had something else in it. Huh? I like nature photography very much. I like Adams and his successors very much. What I don't like is when I feel that I'm being manipulated in an ordinary way. In other words, one time I was with a very celebrated poet, I won't mention his name, and there was a beautiful sunset. He really shocked me. I said to him, because he's an ironist and very New York, and there's this beautiful sunset at Long Island. I say, what do you do about that? I was sort of challenging him, and he said, ignore it. Which, as I told you, is not something I can do. What I don't like about corny nature photography, and when I say corny, I mean that it is, you know that definition of sentimentality, which is unearned emotion. And it's very easy to pull the old heartstrings and get the old spiritual juices flowing when you show a great mountain shot or a beautiful plain shot. Maybe a little too easy unless it's done in a fresh way, and there's always possibilities that you can do it fresh. But so many people are talking about the landscape in that way. Also, I find nature landscape photography here. I was telling someone earlier this. Often troubles me because for me the landscape is all about what's happening in the corner of my eyes and around behind, because the big sky. And so it's circling. The landscape is actually a kind of, in the way that we see, it's a kind of semicircle. And when you put the landscape, and that's the experience of it, at least for me, and when you put that landscape, that sense of life on the edges and going around behind you, when you flatten it out and you put it into a rectangle, there's something wrong about it to me, or it doesn't speak to me unless it's a very beautiful image that doesn't say Montana, because for me, Montana, the landscape, everyone has such a personal view. Everyone feels they sort of own the landscape, they have their own relationship to it. And I feel that way too. And so when someone else decides they're going to show the landscape in a certain way, I'm sort of resisting a little bit. And if it doesn't have that sense of escaping around the edges, I think, no, that's not really what I like. And I may be unfair to some of those photographs because I'm bringing too much of my own interest in the landscape to bear.
Well, not to get into a debate, but what I tell people, we have a gallery in Missoula.
I'm sorry?
We have an art gallery in Missoula, and we show a variety of things, but mostly landscapes. And one time in particular, in the summer, we have all landscapes. And somebody said to me, with too much wine, said, "Where the hell is all the art?"
What are they, what?
Where the hell is all the art? And I said, since man began on earth, man was painting what was in their heart. And I think that's what landscape painters do. They paint what's in their heart.
Yeah, You know, I have nothing against landscape photography or landscape painting. It's actually probably the thing I like best in the Western tradition. It's just very hard to do, I guess that's all, I'd say. And it's very hard, I mean, there's a lot of competition, a lot of great work has been done in this area. And so I guess what I would say is that, you know, my mother's a painter, and she's a fabulous watercolorist, in fact. And what she is what the French call a petit maître, which means a small master, you know, a minor master. That is a great thing to be. And I think that, you know, most of us are minor. It's very rare to be major, and as I said in the talk, and to make honest landscape paintings is a terrific thing to do, in my opinion. Are they going to be great? You know, I have to, one thing, I'm very tough that way. I think you have to be. I would say they're almost never great. But they're very good, and that's good enough. That's what I would say. You know, you have to maintain, if you just say things are, if just because it's a nice picture, you say, why are you condescending to it? I'm not condescending to it. But if you don't say it's a small picture, what are you then going to say about a really great landscape painting? How are you going to describe what the difference is and what a really, really great painting can be and do? You have to maintain that kind of toughness of mind, I think. It's not nice, I don't like it, really, but I've schooled myself to be that way. Yes?
How would you delineate the difference between a good artist and a famous artist? It's in regards to when you were mentioning that there were famous artists and the pictures you had up on the screen saying, I really don't like this work, but he's famous anyway. And I just want to know what your opinion is between a good artist and famous artist.
Well, the artist you're talking about is John Curran. He especially annoys me, obviously. You know, that's saying something, because Abramovich and Hearst also annoy me, but they force me to think about their work, and I would love to just condescend to them wildly, but in fact I continue to think about their work. So if I'm honest, I have to say, despite the fact that a lot of people I don't like at all love this work, Damien Hirst's work, I mean, and Abramovich's work, and I'm not in company I want to keep, and I would love to feel superior. Well, I don't entirely, because at least I'm thinking and questioning. John Curran, on the other hand, he really rubs me the wrong way, because he uses a sort of very seductive quasi-old master technique, and I'm very historically minded, and I love the old masters, and I hate to see their work used in a trivial, silly, contemporary context. And I don't think his strategy, I don't think his little games of publicity are finally very clever. As I said, I mean, I didn't show you, I was afraid to show you his racier pictures, which are of women with just absolutely enormous breasts who look like idiots, painted in a sort of old master, sticky sort of style. And I just think the satire, so-called, or using the imagery, the figurative imagery that way, is not very interesting. And I'm doing a book on Francis Bacon, for heaven's sake. I can deal with tough body stuff. But this just doesn't seem to me interesting, tough body stuff. It seems to me juvenile. And his self-smug if you read this piece in the Times, part of what being an artist is, developing into a good artist is you have to work on your craft, of course, usually, but it's also about developing your sensibility. And his sensibility strikes me as one that I can't respect. He's just too into the money and the fame without enough interesting irony. He doesn't have Hearst's, really outrageous potential ironies. He's He's just a careerist, for God's sake, and he wants to be congratulated for it. Boy, I guess I should have pulled my punches there. Please don't, Yes.
All right. I wanted to thank you for being here tonight. It's great to have you. And my question is a saddlebag on the mule of the earlier question. I'm interested in better understanding your distinction between fame, deserved and earned and developed over time, and celebrity. And I would like to hear a little bit more about your views on Damien Hirst. In my experience, I read his 1997 book, I Want to Spend the Rest of My Life Everywhere and With Everyone,
Right.
Always and Together, Now. And there's a whole chapter in that book about the most effective way to shoot yourself with a pistol in the brain and to die. And it's like there's a lot of gravity in that section in the book, trying to understand how the vulnerable human body can survive gunshot wounds in the head in a bunch of different ways when they're self-inflicted. It seems like Damien Hirst deals with death a lot with his vitrines and the animals. And not many people in this room, I'm sure, are forensic anthropologists or morticians and deal with dead bodies much. And in our society, maybe interacting with the deceased is become something worthy of art, because we don't have a whole lot of avenues to interact with the dead in our society today. And then Damien Hirst speaks to the present time, like with the value of his art. I was in Europe in mid-September 2008 when his Life is Beautiful show opened, or the auction that almost tanked right before Lehman Brothers tanked. And it seems like he'll be remembered as this artist of the time who is really...
I think that's right. I think he is an interesting reflection on his time. But if I understood you correctly, I think he's not actually he's clearly very interested in death, but I don't find his response to death particularly interesting. As I tried to say in the talk, the actual thing, I'm not saying I've had any serious interactions with bodies or anything like that either, but I have seen animals on a ranch, and I know about death in the landscape, I know about hunting, I know about things like that, and it's not what Damien Hirst does. It's actually something very different. These vitrines of dead animals, that's, to me, they're titillating. They're, again, like those fetuses in jars. They're not really a serious meditation on death, I don't think. I mean, I could be wrong, but for me anyway, he's all about touch. He knows that touch is a fantastically loaded concept in contemporary culture. So he works that, and he's very brilliant to do that. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking about my own sense of how touch has been removed from art, and how my own feeling of touch is become very important to me, and that Montana has participated in that, blah, blah, blah. He knows that too. But his response, I think, is a very kind of, I don't know, it's cold, and in a way that I don't find finally satisfying. The vitrines are, I don't think, a great version of death. I think they're a great version of perhaps our culture's, as I said, treatment of animals, perhaps our culture's fear of touching, our fear of decay. Maybe they do effectively convey that. But death, I don't know. I don't really buy it. But you know more about Damien Hirst than I do. I kind of avoid it because I know that it's going to make me anxious, but you've obviously really studied up. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'll do one more. Did you want to? Yeah, go ahead. Not for years, so I'm much too afraid to go there with you.
You said that the aesthetic experience is a primitive form of cognition. I was wondering what you meant by that.
Well, I think what he meant was that it's not just based, as I was saying to Professor Drake, it's really the response to a work of art has a lot to do with our body. De Kooning, when he would paint, which is sort of primitive, de Kooning, when he painted, did not want to paint just with his hand, that was for fancy people. He painted with his whole body. And his pictures, actually, he never, unlike most abstract expressionists, he didn't balloon the pictures out to an enormous scale because he wanted to keep, the human scale. So they're really, his pictures are never really larger than a man stretching out his hands. So he could fit haptically into them, his body sense. And on that level, you see, the apprehension of works of art, it's a very important level, is not what an intellectual usually talks about. It's about inchoate feelings, feelings in our body, touch, the visual sense of touch, space and scale. Scale, for example, is a very complicated concept. It's very important to us. If this room were much smaller, for example, the experience would be very different. We never think about these things, we rarely do, but we have, in my view, we're still very much primates, not so far from monkeys, and we have all kinds of monkey senses that are very physical, and that we make a mistake to condescend to, or for example, early human beings and primates generally, they love the space between a forest and a meadow, so they can retreat to the trees, get away, and then go out into the meadow to work. That's the kind of space human beings like. Why? Why do we like that? I don't know. It's pretty primitive, though. It's pretty primitive. And those kinds of feelings, they don't completely, I don't agree with that remark by Croce, because I think in a great work of art, we bring a lot of our senses to bear, a lot of our intellect to bear, not just one thing. But part of that, what's brought to bear, is very primitive, and necessarily so. Okay, thank you.